The gavel's crack echoed through the hushed courtroom like a gunshot, but it was Judge Patricia Chen's voice, cold, measured, and seething with barely restrained fury that made every person in the packed gallery hold their breath. Jessica Hartwell, you stand convicted by a jury of your peers of 4 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Judge Chen's words fell like stones into still water, each one creating ripples of tension through the Alameda County Superior Court in Oakland, California. The date was September 18, 2024, and what had been called the trial of the decade was finally reaching its conclusion. At the defense table, 41-year-old Jessica Hartwell sat motionless in her navy blue suit, the same professional attire she'd worn throughout the trial, carefully chosen to remind jurors of her decade-long career as a respected ICU nurse at Oakland Memorial Hospital. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Her expression was carefully neutral, almost serene, as if she were waiting for a routine staff meeting rather than a sentence that would determine whether she spent the rest of her life behind bars. But her hands, clenched white-knuckled on the table in front of her, told a different story. Over a period of 18 months, Judge Chen continued, her voice rising with intensity, you systematically befriended 4 elderly patients under your care. You gained their trust. You presented yourself as their devoted caregiver, their friend, practically family. And then you convinced each of them to name you as a beneficiary on their life insurance policies. The judge paused, letting the words hang in the air. In the gallery, family members of the victims, children, and grandchildren who had trusted this smiling nurse with their loved ones sat rigid with grief and rage. Margaret Walsh, 76 years old, Robert Chen, 82, Dorothy Martinez, 79, and James Richardson, 81. 4 people who survived raising families, building careers, contributing to their communities for decades. 4 people who trusted you with their lives, and you murdered each of them one by administering fatal doses of potassium chloride into their IV lines, then collecting on insurance policies totaling $1.2 million. Jessica's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Throughout the trial, she had maintained a facade of wounded innocence. She was being persecuted, she insisted, targeted by jealous colleagues and a system looking for a scapegoat for natural deaths. Even when the evidence mounted the insurance policies, the suspicious timing of the deaths, the toxicology reports showing lethal potassium levels. The surveillance footage of her accessing the pharmacy, Jessica had kept her mask in place, until her daughter testified. Judge Chen's gaze shifted momentarily to the gallery, where 16-year-old Sarah Hartwell sat next to her father, Jessica's ex-husband, David. Her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights and the trauma of having exposed her own mother as a serial killer. What makes your crimes particularly egregious, Judge Chen said, her voice taking on a harder edge, is not just the premeditation, not just the betrayal of your patient's trust, not just your exploitation of vulnerable elderly people for financial gain. It's the complete absence of remorse. Throughout this trial, you have maintained your innocence despite overwhelming evidence. You have blamed everyone but yourself. You showed not a single moment of genuine regret for taking 4 lives. The judge's next words came out sharp as a blade. Until your own daughter testified against you. The courtroom seemed to inhale collectively. This had been the turning point of the trial, the moment when Sarah Hartwell trembling and crying on the witness stand, had described finding her mother's practice notebook hidden in the garage, filled with pages of signature practice for all 4 victims' names, along with handwritten notes about their medical conditions, medications, and insurance policy details. Sarah had testified about overhearing phone calls where her mother discussed the investments paying off, about finding unexplained deposit receipts for large sums, about her mother's increasingly expensive purchases, a new car, designer clothes, luxury vacations, all funded by blood money from murdered patients. And most damning of all, Sarah had testified about confronting her mother, and Jessica's chilling response. They were going to die soon anyway. I just helped them along and made sure their money went to someone who could actually use it. Jessica's mask had cracked when Sarah took the stand. For the first time, the jury had seen genuine emotion on Jessica Hartwell's face, not remorse for her victims, but rage at her daughter for betraying her. Your daughter, Judge Chen continued, showed more courage, more integrity, and more genuine compassion for your victims than you have shown in your entire life. At 16 years old, she made the hardest decision any child could make to tell the truth about her own mother, knowing it would result in your conviction and incarceration. She put justice for your victims above her own comfort, her own family, her own mother. That is real courage. That is real morality. Jessica's carefully maintained composure was fracturing. Her lips pressed into a thin line. A muscle in her jaw twitched. The jury has recommended that you be sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, Judge Chen stated. This court accepts that recommendation. You will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. You will never work as a nurse again. You will never harm another patient. You will never profit from another person's death. You will grow old and die behind bars, and that is exactly what you deserve. Judge Chen leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Jessica. You took an oath to do no harm. You violated that. Oath in the most fundamental way possible. You weaponized your position of trust, your medical knowledge, and your access to vulnerable patients to commit murder for profit. Healthcare workers are supposed to be healers. You became a predator. The judge's voice dropped lower, more intense. If there is any justice in this world, you will spend every remaining day of your life thinking about Margaret Walsh, Robert Chen, Dorothy Martinez, and James Richardson. You will remember their faces, their trust in you, and the fact that you extinguished their lives for money. You stole their final years from them and their families for $1.2 million, approximately $300,000 per life. That's what you decided a human life was worth. Jessica's composure finally shattered. They were going to die anyway, she burst out, her voice sharp and defensive, earning a sharp rebuke from her attorney who grabbed her arm. But the outburst, her first unguarded words in open court, revealed everything Judge Chen had just articulated. Not remorse, not regret, just justification. Bailiff, remove the defendant, Judge Chen ordered, her voice cold. Jessica Hartwell, you are hereby remanded to the custody of the California Department of Corrections to begin serving your sentence immediately. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell again. Bailiffs moved toward Jessica, who was now standing, her face flushed with anger rather than shame, her eyes scanning the gallery until they found her daughter. Sarah was crying, her father's arm around her shoulders. "Sarah," Jessica called out as the bailiffs grasped her arms. "Sarah, how could you do this to me? I'm your mother. I gave you everything." Sarah buried her face in her father's chest, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm your mother," Jessica shouted again as she was led toward the door, her voice rising with fury rather than grief. "You destroyed our family. You sent your own mother to prison. How can you live with yourself?" The courtroom erupted, family members of the victims shouting at Jessica, calling her a monster. Court officers moving to maintain order, journalists frantically taking notes. Through it all, Sarah Hartwell sat crying in her father's arms, the teenage girl who had shown more courage than most adults would possess, who had chosen truth over family loyalty, and who would carry the burden of that choice for the rest of her life. As the door closed behind Jessica Hartwell, cutting off her angry shouts, Judge Chen remained at the bench for a moment, looking at the 4 framed photographs that had sat on the prosecutor's table throughout the trial. Margaret, Robert, Dorothy, and James, all smiling in happier times before they met the nurse who would kill them. 4 lives taken. 1 murderer caught. 1 daughter forced to choose between protecting her mother and seeking justice for the dead. But to understand how a trusted ICU nurse became a serial killer, how she selected her victims and executed her plan, how she almost got away with murder multiple times, and how her own teenage daughter ultimately brought her to justice, we must return to the beginning. 18 months earlier, Margaret Walsh was excited to be alive. At 76 years old, with her heart condition finally stabilized after years of complications, Margaret felt like she had been given a second chance. Her cardiologist had adjusted her medications. Her recent echocardiogram showed improvement, and for the first time in months, she had the energy to do the things she loved: tending her garden, playing with her grandchildren, and volunteering at the Oakland Public Library, where she had worked as a librarian for 40 years before retirement. "Mom was doing really well," testified Margaret's daughter, Linda Walsh Porter, during the trial, her voice breaking with grief and rage. After years of struggling with her heart, she finally turned a corner. Her doctors were optimistic. She was making plans. She wanted to take a trip to see her sister in Portland. She was planning her granddaughter's 8th birthday party. She was talking about Christmas. She had life ahead of her. And then she met Jessica Hartwell. Margaret had been admitted to Oakland Memorial Hospital on February 15, 2023, for what was supposed to be a routine 3-day stay to adjust her heart medications under medical supervision. It was a precautionary measure her cardiologist recommended, given her history of arrhythmias. Margaret wasn't worried. She'd had similar hospitalizations before, and always returned home feeling better. Jessica Hartwell was assigned as Margaret's primary ICU nurse for the duration of her stay. To Margaret and her family, Jessica seemed like a godsend, attentive, compassionate, knowledgeable, and genuinely interested in Margaret's well-being. She spent extra time talking with Margaret about her life, her family, her interests. She made sure Margaret was comfortable, adjusted her pillows, brought her warm blankets, and chatted with her about books and gardening. Jessica was wonderful with Mom, Linda testified. She seemed to genuinely care. She would spend her breaks sitting with Mom, just talking. She knew all about our family, asked to see photos of the grandkids, remembered details about our lives. We thought Mom was so lucky to have such a caring nurse. We had no idea Jessica was grooming her. Because that's exactly what Jessica Hartwell was doing, selecting Margaret Walsh as her first victim. Studying her, learning about her life and family, and positioning herself to gain Margaret's trust completely. The evidence recovered after Jessica's arrest would reveal that this had been deliberate, calculated, and part of a pattern that Jessica would repeat with devastating effectiveness over the following 18 months. But to understand how Jessica Hartwell, a respected ICU nurse, mother, and seemingly normal middle-class woman, became a serial killer who murdered elderly patients for insurance money, we must examine her background, her financial pressures, and the toxic combination of narcissism, greed, and complete lack of empathy that would lead her to commit 4 murders while believing she would never be caught. Jessica Lynn Monroe was born on March 8, 1983, in Sacramento, California, to middle-class parents Thomas and Ellen Monroe. Her father worked as an accountant. Her mother was an elementary school teacher. Jessica was the middle child between an older brother, Kevin, and a younger sister, Amy. By all accounts, her childhood was unremarkable stable home, adequate parenting, no obvious trauma or abuse that would explain her later actions. Jessica was always different, testified her sister, Amy Monroe Stevens, during the trial's background phase. Not in obvious ways that would make you think she'd become a killer. But she lacked something. Empathy, I guess. When we were kids and Kevin or I would get hurt or upset, Jessica wouldn't comfort us. She'd watch with this curious, detached expression like she was studying us. When our dog died when I was 12, I was devastated, and Jessica's response was annoyance that I was crying so much. She said, "It was just a dog. Get over it." My parents chalked it up to her being pragmatic, but looking back, I realize she just didn't feel things the way normal people do. Jessica was academically capable, graduating from Sacramento High School with a 3.4 GPA and sufficient test scores to attend California State University, Sacramento. She had initially planned to major in business, drawn to the idea of wealth and financial success, but switched to nursing after her freshman year. Jessica told me she chose nursing because she'd always wanted to help people, testified her college roommate, Michelle Torres. But I remember her real reason. She said nursing was a stable career where you'd always have job security and decent money. She talked about how nurses were trusted and respected, how you had access to medications and vulnerable patients, how much power you'd have over people in the hospital. At the time, I thought she was just being realistic about career considerations. Now I realize she was attracted to the power dynamic, the access, the opportunity. Jessica graduated with her BSN in 2005 and obtained her RN license shortly thereafter. She began working at Oakland Memorial Hospital in 2006, initially on a general medical floor before transferring to the ICU in 2008. Her performance reviews were generally positive. She was clinically competent, knowledgeable, and professional with colleagues. However, several subtle red flags appeared in her evaluations over the years that, in retrospect, suggested concerning characteristics. Nurse Hartwell demonstrates excellent clinical skills and medical knowledge, read a 2011 performance review. However, some patients and families have reported that her bedside manner feels impersonal or detached. While she provides technically competent care, she may benefit from developing more emotional connection with patients. A 2015 evaluation noted, Nurse Hartwell has been observed to be more engaged with patients who are educated, articulate, and from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. She should ensure she provides the same level of attentive care to all patients regardless of their background. These observations, while concerning, weren't considered serious enough to warrant disciplinary action or prevent Jessica from advancing in her career. She became a senior ICU nurse, training newer nurses and occasionally serving as charge nurse when needed. To hospital administration and most of her colleagues, Jessica Hartwell was a competent, professional nurse who had dedicated nearly 2 decades to patient care. But beneath that professional exterior, Jessica was struggling with financial problems that would ultimately motivate her to commit murder. Jessica had married David Hartwell in 2006, shortly after beginning work at Oakland Memorial. David was a software engineer earning approximately $110,000 annually. Combined with Jessica's nursing salary of about $85,000, the couple had a comfortable household income of roughly $195,000 per year. They purchased a home in the Oakland suburbs, had a daughter, Sarah, in 2008, and from the outside appeared to be living a successful middle-class life. But appearances were deceiving. Jessica had expensive tastes and a compulsive need to present an image of wealth and success that far exceeded their actual financial capacity. She insisted on designer clothing, luxury vacations, expensive cars, and maintaining a lifestyle more appropriate for someone earning 3 times their household income. Jessica was obsessed with status and appearing wealthy. David Hartwell testified during the trial, his voice heavy with a mixture of grief and anger. She would spend money we didn't have on things we didn't need just to impress people. She'd buy designer handbags that cost thousands of dollars. She'd insist we take expensive vacations we couldn't afford. She'd lease luxury cars with payments that stretched our budget to breaking. I tried to talk to her about living within our means, but she'd become furious. She said she worked hard and deserved nice things, that she wasn't going to live like a peasant, that I was too cheap and unambitious. The spending led to mounting debt. By 2015, the Hartwells had accumulated over $85,000 in credit card debt across multiple cards, had taken out a home equity loan for $60,000 to pay off previous credit cards, and were falling behind on their mortgage payments. David pushed for bankruptcy or drastic lifestyle changes. Jessica refused, insisting they would figure something out. The financial pressure contributed to the deterioration of their marriage. David and Jessica separated in 2018 and divorced in 2019, with joint custody of their daughter Sarah. The divorce settlement required Jessica to refinance the house in her name alone and take on most of the marital debt. Her financial situation, already precarious, became desperate. After the divorce, Jessica's income was cut nearly in half. She went from a household income of $195,000 to her individual income of about $85,000, testified forensic accountant Robert Martinez during the trial. But her spending didn't decrease. She continued living the same lifestyle, buying the same expensive items, taking the same vacations. By late 2022, she was drowning financially. She had maxed out every credit card, was behind on mortgage payments, had collection agencies calling. She needed a significant infusion of cash, or she would face bankruptcy and likely lose her house. It was in this context desperate financial need combined with her position of power and access in the ICU that Jessica Hartwell made the calculated decision to murder patients for their life insurance money. The evidence would show that she began planning in late 2022, researching insurance fraud, studying cases of medical murders, and identifying potential victims among her patients. What Jessica hadn't counted on was that her daughter, Sarah, would be paying attention to her mother's behavior, would find the evidence Jessica thought was safely hidden, and would ultimately have the courage to expose her own mother as a serial killer. But first, Jessica would successfully murder 4 elderly patients over 18 months while believing her careful planning, her position of trust, and her medical knowledge would allow her to commit the perfect crimes. Margaret Walsh's hospitalization in February 2023 provided Jessica with her first opportunity. Over Margaret's 3-day stay, Jessica cultivated a friendship that extended beyond normal nurse-patient boundaries. She spent extensive time with Margaret, shared personal stories, carefully constructed lies mixed with truth, and positioned herself as someone who genuinely cared about Margaret's well-being. On Margaret's final day in the hospital, February 17, 2023, Jessica brought up the topic of life insurance with what appeared to be casual concern. "Margaret, can I ask you something personal?" Jessica said, according to Margaret's roommate during her hospital stay, 68-year-old Betty Johnson, who would later testify about overhearing the conversation. "Do you have life insurance? I know it's none of my business, but with your heart condition, I just want to make sure your family would be taken care of if anything happened." Margaret, touched by what she perceived as genuine concern, admitted that she did have a small life insurance policy through her late husband's union, but had been thinking about increasing it given her health concerns. Jessica suggested that Margaret consider adding multiple beneficiaries to ensure the money went to people she cared about, rather than being tied up in estate proceedings. Betty testified. She said something like, "Sometimes it's good to name specific people as beneficiaries, so your wishes are honored immediately." Margaret seemed to appreciate the advice. Jessica gave her the name of an insurance agent, a friend who had helped other patients, and offered to help Margaret understand her options. This was the beginning of Jessica's plan. Over the following 2 weeks, Jessica stayed in contact with Margaret, calling to check on her, texting to see how she was feeling, even visiting Margaret at her home once when Jessica was in the neighborhood. To Margaret and her family, this level of care from a nurse seemed extraordinary and touching. In reality, Jessica was grooming Margaret for murder. Jessica helped Mom apply for a $250,000 term life insurance policy, Linda Walsh Porter testified. Mom was so grateful for the help. Jessica went with her to meet with the insurance agent, helped her fill out paperwork, explained all the options, and she convinced Mom to name her Jessica as one of the beneficiaries alongside our family. She told Mom something about how nurses were often named in policies because families wanted to honor their caregivers. Mom thought it was a lovely gesture. She named her children as beneficiaries for $200,000 total, and she named Jessica as a beneficiary for $50,000 as a thank you for such wonderful care. The insurance policy was approved on March 15, 2023. Margaret Walsh was murdered exactly 2 weeks later, on March 29, 2023. Margaret had been readmitted to Oakland Memorial on March 27, 2023, for what was supposed to be a routine checkup and medication adjustment, the same type of precautionary hospitalization she'd had a month earlier. Jessica, learning of Margaret's admission, immediately arranged to be assigned as her nurse, claiming that Margaret had specifically requested her due to the rapport they'd developed during the February stay. "I thought it was sweet that Mom wanted Jessica as her nurse," Linda testified, tears streaming down her face. "Mom talked about Jessica constantly, what a wonderful person she was, how caring, how Jessica had even helped her with insurance. Mom trusted Jessica completely. We all did. We had no idea that Jessica had targeted Mom, had manipulated her into signing that insurance policy, and was planning to kill her." On the evening of March 29, 2023, Jessica worked the night shift in the ICU, where Margaret was being monitored overnight as a precaution. Margaret's condition was stable. Her most recent tests had shown slight improvement, and her cardiologist planned to discharge her the following morning with adjusted medications. She was expected to return home healthy, but at approximately 2:47 a.m. on March 30th, Margaret Walsh went into sudden cardiac arrest. The code blue was called, the resuscitation team responded, but Margaret could not be revived. She was pronounced dead at 3:11 a.m., just 30 minutes after her last recorded vital signs had been normal and stable. The death was shocking, but not completely unexpected given Margaret's cardiac history, testified Dr. Robert Foster, the ICU physician on duty that night. She had a history of arrhythmias and heart failure. When elderly cardiac patients die suddenly during hospitalization, it's usually attributed to their underlying disease. I signed the death certificate listing cardiac arrhythmia as cause of death. I had no reason to suspect foul play. The nurse who had been caring for her, Jessica Hartwell, had documented everything properly, had called the code immediately, had done everything right according to protocol. What Dr. Foster and everyone else didn't know at the time was that Jessica had murdered Margaret Walsh by injecting a lethal dose of potassium chloride directly into Margaret's IV line approximately 15 minutes before the cardiac arrest. The potassium chloride caused Margaret's heart to develop fatal arrhythmia, mimicking a natural cardiac event in a patient with pre-existing heart disease. It was a method Jessica had researched extensively. Potassium chloride is difficult to detect in standard postmortem toxicology because potassium is naturally present in the body and levels rise after death, making it hard to distinguish natural levels from injected amounts without specific testing that's rarely ordered. Potassium chloride is the perfect murder weapon for someone working in a hospital, testified Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic pathologist and expert on medical murders during the trial. It's readily available in hospitals, used legitimately for IV supplementation. It causes cardiac arrest that looks natural, especially in patients with heart disease. And it's very difficult to detect after death unless you're specifically looking for it with specialized tests that aren't part of routine autopsies. Jessica Hartwell knew all of this. She had researched it carefully. And she chose her victims' elderly patients with cardiac issues, specifically because their deaths from cardiac arrest wouldn't raise suspicions. Margaret's family was devastated, but not suspicious. Margaret had heart disease. She had died in the hospital under medical care. It was tragic, but seemed like a natural progression of her illness. They grieved, held a funeral, and began processing their loss. Jessica Hartwell attended the funeral. She cried, hugged Margaret's family members, and expressed her sorrow at losing such a wonderful patient and friend. Linda Walsh Porter would later testify that Jessica's grief seemed genuine at the time, though in retrospect she realized it had been pure performance. 2 months later, Jessica collected the $50,000 insurance payout from Margaret's policy, claiming it to her ex-husband and daughter as an unexpected inheritance from a grateful patient. She used the money to catch up on her mortgage payments, pay off several credit cards, and take Sarah on an expensive vacation to Hawaii. I should have questioned where the money came from, David Hartwell testified, his voice filled with regret. Jessica's explanation seemed plausible. She said an elderly patient she'd cared for had left her money in her will out of gratitude. It's unusual, but not unheard of for nurses to receive small bequests from grateful patients. I accepted it. I didn't investigate. If I had, I might have prevented the other 3 murders. But the money, while temporarily relieving Jessica's financial pressure, wasn't enough to solve her problems long term. She had expensive tastes and mounting debts that $50,000 couldn't fully address. Within 3 months, Jessica was again facing financial crisis, and she was already identifying her next victim. Robert Chen, 82, was admitted to Oakland Memorial's ICU on June 5, 2023, following complications from pneumonia. A retired mathematics professor who had taught at UC Berkeley for 40 years, Robert was a widower who lived alone but remained sharp, active, and engaged despite his age. He had recovered well from the pneumonia and was being kept in the ICU for observation as a precaution given his age. Jessica Hartwell arranged to be assigned as Robert's nurse, using the same strategies she had employed with Margaret: extra attention, personal conversations, genuine seeming interest in his life and family. Robert, lonely after losing his wife 5 years earlier, appreciated Jessica's company and attention. My father talked about Jessica constantly during his hospitalization, testified Robert's son, Michael Chen. He said she was the kindest nurse he'd ever had, that she actually listened to him and cared about his stories. He showed me photos on his phone of Jessica sitting with him during her breaks, chatting. I was grateful someone was keeping my dad company, since I could only visit in the evenings after work. I thought Jessica was a compassionate professional. I had no idea she was sizing up my father as her next victim. Jessica's approach with Robert followed the same pattern. She introduced the topic of life insurance, expressed concern about his family being taken care of, recommended an insurance agent, and offered to help with the paperwork. Robert, with substantial assets from his academic career and retirement savings, already had life insurance but allowed Jessica to help him review and update his policies. Jessica convinced my father to add a new $300,000 term policy, telling him it would give his children and grandchildren more financial security, Michael testified. She helped him apply, accompanied him to appointments after his discharge from the hospital, and somehow convinced him to name her as a $75,000 beneficiary. Dad told me he wanted to honor the nurse who had been so kind to him. It seemed odd, but sweet. I never imagined Jessica was systematically manipulating my father to set up her next murder. The insurance policy was approved on July 22, 2023. Robert Chen was murdered on August 10, 2023. Robert had been readmitted to Oakland Memorial on August 8, 2023, for a minor issue, dehydration and fatigue, that his doctor wanted to address with IV fluids and monitoring. It was supposed to be a 24 to 48-hour stay at most. Jessica again arranged to be his nurse. At approximately 1:30 a.m. on August 10th, Robert Chen experienced sudden cardiac arrest. The code was called, but Robert could not be revived. He was pronounced dead at 1:52 a.m. Given his age and recent health issues, the death was attributed to natural cardiac causes. Jessica had used the same method potassium chloride injected into Robert's IV line and had achieved the same result. A death that appeared natural and raised no immediate suspicions. Jessica attended Robert's funeral, again performing grief and paying respects to a family that had trusted her completely. 2 months later, she collected the $75,000 insurance payout. Combined with the $50,000 from Margaret Walsh, Jessica had now made $125,000 from 2 murders, and she was growing confident in her system. The money was solving Jessica's immediate financial problems, but it was also feeding into her narcissism and sense of invulnerability. Testified forensic psychologist Dr. Sarah Martinez, who evaluated Jessica after her arrest. She had successfully killed 2 people, collected on their life insurance, and suffered no consequences. She attended their funerals, comforted their families, and was praised for her caring nature. This reinforced her belief that she was smarter than everyone else, that her position as a trusted nurse made her untouchable, that she could continue killing without being caught. It's a pattern we see in serial killers. Early success leads to increased confidence and escalating behavior. Jessica's 3rd victim was Dorothy Martinez, 79, a retired teacher who was admitted to Oakland Memorial's ICU on October 3, 2023, after a fall at her home resulted in a broken hip and required surgery. Dorothy's prognosis was good. The surgery had been successful, and she was expected to make a full recovery with physical therapy. But she needed several days in the ICU for post-surgical monitoring given her age. Jessica, now openly seeking out elderly patients to befriend, arranged to be assigned to Dorothy's care. She followed the same pattern that had worked with Margaret and Robert: cultivate a friendship, gain trust, introduce the topic of life insurance, help with paperwork, and convince the victim to name her as a beneficiary. Dorothy was a trusting, sweet woman who believed the best of everyone, testified Dorothy's daughter, Elena Martinez Suarez. When she told me about this wonderful nurse who was helping her review her insurance, I thought it was a bit odd, but assumed Jessica was just being helpful. Dorothy named Jessica as a $60,000 beneficiary on a $250,000 policy, saying she wanted to thank her for such exceptional care. I should have questioned it more. I should have protected my mother. But I trusted the system, trusted the hospital, trusted that nurses were there to help patients, not murder them for money. Dorothy's insurance policy was approved on November 5, 2023. She was murdered on November 18, 2023, using the same potassium chloride method during a night shift when Jessica was her nurse. Dorothy went into cardiac arrest at 3:15 a.m. and could not be revived despite aggressive resuscitation attempts. Her death was attributed to cardiac complications following her surgery, tragic but medically plausible for a 79-year-old. Jessica collected $60,000 from Dorothy's life insurance in January 2024, bringing her total murder proceeds to $185,000 from 3 victims. She had now refined her system to the point where she felt completely confident select elderly patients with cardiac or respiratory conditions, befriend them, get them to add her to their insurance policies, kill them with potassium chloride during night shifts, and collect the money months later after their deaths were ruled natural. But Jessica's confidence was about to lead to a fatal miscalculation. She was about to target a fourth victim, and this time someone would notice the pattern. James Richardson, 81, was admitted to Oakland Memorial's ICU on January 28, 2024, for treatment of heart failure exacerbation. A retired postal worker and military veteran, James was beloved in his community for his volunteer work and his devotion to his family. He had been managing his heart condition for years and, while seriously ill, was responding well to treatment. Jessica followed her established pattern with James befriend him, gain his trust, help him with insurance, and position herself as a beneficiary. James, grateful for Jessica's attention and care, agreed to add her as a $65,000 beneficiary on a $300,000 policy he purchased with Jessica's assistance. My grandfather trusted Jessica completely, testified James's granddaughter, Michelle Richardson. He talked about her constantly, how kind she was, how much time she spent with him, how she even came to visit on her days off. When he told us he was adding her to his insurance policy, several family members questioned it. We thought it was inappropriate, but Grandpa insisted, saying Jessica had been so wonderful, and he wanted to honor her. We didn't want to upset him while he was sick, so we dropped it. That decision will haunt me forever. James's insurance policy was approved on February 20th, 2024. Jessica murdered him on March 5th, 2024, following the same method that had worked 3 previous times. James went into cardiac arrest at 2:28 a.m. during Jessica's night shift. He could not be revived and was pronounced dead at 2:55 a.m. But this time, someone noticed a pattern. Dr. Lisa Anderson, a cardiologist at Oakland Memorial who had consulted on James Richardson's care, was reviewing his chart and happened to see Jessica Hartwell's name as the primary nurse. Something nagged at her memory she had seen Jessica's name before in connection with patient deaths. I pulled up records for recent ICU deaths and started cross-referencing, Dr. Anderson testified. What I found was deeply disturbing. 4 elderly patients with cardiac conditions had died suddenly during night shifts over the previous year, and Jessica Hartwell had been the primary nurse for all 4. While each death individually looked like natural cardiac events, the pattern was statistically improbable. 4 elderly cardiac patients, all dying during night shifts when Jessica was their nurse, all within 18 months. That warranted investigation. Dr. Anderson reported her concerns to hospital administration and to the hospital's medical quality director, Dr. Robert Chen. An internal review was initiated, and what the investigators found was even more alarming. All 4 deceased patients had recently added Jessica Hartwell as a beneficiary on life insurance policies worth substantial amounts, and Jessica had collected or was in the process of collecting significant payouts from all 4 deaths. Once we identified the insurance connection, this went from a possible pattern of unfortunate deaths to clear evidence of serial murder for financial gain, Dr. Chen testified. We immediately contacted law enforcement and the medical examiner's office. Oakland Memorial suspended Jessica pending investigation, and we began the process of reviewing every patient death that occurred during her shifts over the previous 5 years. Oakland Police Department's Homicide Division was notified on March 8, 2024, 3 days after James Richardson's death. Detective Sarah Williams was assigned to lead the investigation into what appeared to be a series of medical murders by a trusted ICU nurse. When I first received the case file from the hospital, I was skeptical, Detective Williams testified. Medical murders are rare, and false allegations against healthcare workers can destroy careers. But as I reviewed the evidence for deaths following the same pattern, all with the same nurse present, all with insurance payouts going to that nurse, it became clear this wasn't coincidence. This was serial murder. Detective Williams assembled a team of investigators and began the systematic work of building a case against Jessica Hartwell. The investigation would proceed on multiple fronts, exhuming and re-examining the bodies of the victims to determine true cause of death, analyzing Jessica's financial records, interviewing families and colleagues, and reviewing hospital surveillance footage and electronic medical records. The medical investigation was crucial. All 4 victims had been cremated or buried following their deaths, but in 3 of the 4 cases, Margaret Walsh had been cremated. Families agreed to exhumation for comprehensive forensic examination. The bodies of Robert Chen, Dorothy Martinez, and James Richardson were exhumed in late March 2024. Dr. Patricia Foster, a forensic pathologist specializing in toxicology, conducted the re-examinations with specific focus on detecting potassium chloride poisoning. Using specialized testing on vitreous humor, fluid from the eye, and tissue samples, Dr. Foster made devastating findings. All 3 exhumed bodies showed evidence consistent with potassium chloride poisoning, Dr. Foster testified. The potassium levels in vitreous humor were extraordinarily elevated, far beyond what would be expected from natural post-mortem changes. Additionally, I found injection sites on the arms, consistent with someone accessing IV ports and injecting substances. Combined with the circumstances of death, sudden cardiac arrest in patients being monitored in an ICU, my conclusion was that all 3 victims were murdered by injection of lethal potassium chloride doses. The forensic findings transformed the investigation from suspicion to confirmation. Jessica Hartwell had murdered at least 3 patients, and almost certainly 4, including Margaret Walsh, whose cremated remains couldn't be tested. The next challenge was proving that Jessica had administered the lethal injections and establishing her motive and opportunity. Financial forensics provided clear motive. Analysis of Jessica's bank accounts, credit card statements, and financial history revealed her desperate financial situation in late 2022 and early 2023. Followed by sudden large deposits corresponding to insurance payouts from the victims' deaths. The deposits were documented and traceable: $50,000 from Margaret Walsh's policy in May 2023, $75,000 from Robert Chen's policy in October 2023, $60,000 from Dorothy Martinez's policy in January 2024, and a pending claim for $65,000 from James Richardson's policy. Jessica's financial records tell the story of her motive clearly, testified forensic accountant Robert Martinez. She was drowning in debt in late 2022. Then, suddenly, in mid-2023, she receives a $50,000 payment from a life insurance company. 3 months later, another $75,000. Then $60,000. Each payment temporarily relieves her financial pressure, allowing her to pay debts and maintain her lifestyle. But her spending continues to exceed her income, creating need for the next murder and the next insurance payment. It's a pattern of murder for financial gain. Hospital records and surveillance footage established Jessica's opportunity. Electronic medical records showed Jessica had been the primary nurse for all 4 victims during the night shifts when they died. Badge swipe records confirmed she had been in the ICU at the times of death. Pharmacy access logs showed Jessica had access to the medication dispensary where potassium chloride was stored shortly before each victim's cardiac arrest. The pharmacy access records were particularly damning, testified Detective Williams. We could track exactly when Jessica accessed potassium chloride from the secure medication dispensary. In all 4 cases, she accessed potassium chloride between 30 and 90 minutes before the victim went into cardiac arrest. While potassium chloride is legitimately used in the ICU, none of the 4 victims had physician orders for potassium supplementation at the times Jessica accessed it. She was taking medication she wasn't authorized to administer and using it to murder her patients. Surveillance cameras in the ICU hallways captured Jessica entering and exiting each victim's room during the critical time periods, though the cameras didn't capture inside the rooms where the actual murders occurred. Combined with the pharmacy access records, the footage established Jessica's presence and opportunity. Witness testimony from families established Jessica's pattern of befriending victims, helping with insurance applications, and positioning herself to benefit from their deaths. The testimony was heartbreaking family members describing how Jessica had seemed so caring and trustworthy, how she had manipulated their loved ones into naming her as a beneficiary, and how they had been completely deceived by her performance of compassion. But perhaps the most damning evidence, the evidence that would ultimately prove absolutely crucial to Jessica's conviction, had yet to be discovered. That evidence was hidden in Jessica Hartwell's garage in a cardboard box labeled Old Nursing Textbooks, and it would be found not by detectives, but by Jessica's own 16-year-old daughter, Sarah. While Detective Williams and her team were building their case in March and early April 2024, Jessica Hartwell had been suspended from Oakland Memorial pending investigation, but had not yet been arrested. She knew she was under suspicion. The hospital had informed her of the review, and she had retained an attorney. But she maintained her innocence, claiming the deaths were natural and the insurance money was legitimate gratitude from patients who had wanted to provide for her. Jessica was remarkably confident even after being suspended, Detective Williams testified. When I first interviewed her as part of the investigation, she was calm, cooperative, and completely denied any wrongdoing. She said the patients had all died of natural causes related to their underlying diseases. She acknowledged being named as an insurance beneficiary, but claimed this was the patient's choice, not something she had solicited. She portrayed herself as a victim, a dedicated nurse being persecuted because of unfortunate coincidences. Jessica's confidence stemmed from her belief that without direct evidence of her administering lethal injections, no witnesses, no video from inside the patient rooms, no admission from her prosecutors couldn't prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but Jessica believed she could create enough doubt to avoid conviction. What Jessica didn't know was that she had kept extensive notes about her planning, her victims, and her crimes notes she thought were well hidden, but which would soon be discovered by the one person she never suspected would betray her. her own. Daughter. Sarah Hartwell was 16 years old in April 2024, a high school junior living with her mother in the Oakland suburbs and spending alternate weekends and holidays with her father, David. A quiet, thoughtful teenager who excelled academically, Sarah had always been close to her mother despite her parents' divorce. Jessica had positioned herself as Sarah's best friend and confidant, frequently sharing complaints about her ex-husband, her job stress, and her financial struggles. "I thought I knew my mother," Sarah testified during the trial, tears streaming down her face. "She was my mom. I loved her. I trusted her. When the hospital suspended her, and she told me it was all a misunderstanding, that jealous colleagues were making false accusations, I believed her. I defended her to my dad when he expressed concerns. I couldn't imagine my own mother was a murderer." But as the investigation progressed and details became public through media coverage, Sarah began having doubts. Her mother's explanations about where the money had come from grateful patients leaving bequests seemed increasingly implausible. The timing of her mother's sudden financial improvements, coinciding exactly with patient deaths, was suspicious. And Sarah had noticed disturbing changes in her mother's behavior over the previous year. Mom became secretive, Sarah testified. She would lock herself in her office for hours. She would hide her phone screen when I came near. She became obsessed with true crime shows and documentaries about unsolved murders. At the time, I thought it was just a hobby or way to decompress from work stress. Now I realize she was studying how criminals got caught and trying to avoid their mistakes. Sarah had also noticed her mother spending time in the garage late at night, which was unusual since the garage was primarily used for storage. When Sarah asked what she was doing out there, Jessica would become defensive and evasive, claiming she was organizing or looking for old papers. On April 15, 2024, about 6 weeks after James Richardson's death and 3 weeks after the police investigation had become public, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. Her mother had gone to meet with her attorney, leaving Sarah alone in the house. Sarah decided to search the garage to see what her mother had been doing out there. "I know it was snooping, and I felt guilty," Sarah testified. "But I was scared. Things weren't adding up. Mom's stories about the insurance money didn't make sense. The police investigation was serious. I needed to know the truth. So I went through boxes in the garage looking for, I didn't even know what. Just something that would help me understand what was really going on." What Sarah found would haunt her forever, and would provide prosecutors with the evidence they needed to prove Jessica's guilt beyond any doubt. In a cardboard box on a high shelf, hidden behind old holiday decorations and labeled Old Nursing textbooks, in a clear attempt at misdirection, Sarah found a spiral-bound notebook filled with her mother's handwriting. The notebook contained page after page of notes, planning, and documentation of Jessica's 4 murders. The first pages contained research notes about potassium chloride, its effects on the heart, lethal dosage ranges, detection difficulties, and case studies of previous medical murders using this method. Jessica had documented everything she learned about how to use potassium chloride as an undetectable murder weapon. Subsequent pages contained victim profiles. For each of the 4 victims, Jessica had created detailed profiles including their medical conditions, family situations, financial status, and insurance coverage. She had written notes about their vulnerabilities and how to exploit them. Margaret Walsh, profile. Widow, lonely, trusts easily. Cardiac history makes sudden death plausible. 3 children who visit regularly but not constantly opportunities during night shifts. Has existing insurance but may be open to increasing coverage. Approach. Befriend. Express concern for family. Suggest insurance agent. The notebook contained similar profiles for Robert Chen, Dorothy Martinez, and James Richardson, each with detailed notes about their medical conditions, their families, and Jessica's plan for manipulating them into naming her as a beneficiary. Most damning were pages where Jessica had practiced forging the victims' signatures. Page after page showed Jessica writing Margaret Walsh, Robert Chen, Dorothy Martinez, and James Richardson over and over again, perfecting her ability to replicate their handwriting. While Jessica had ultimately not needed to forge their signatures on insurance documents, she had successfully convinced each victim to sign voluntarily. The practice pages demonstrated her intent and premeditation. The notebook also contained Jessica's post-murder notes and reflections. Entry dated March 30th, 1923, day of Margaret Walsh's death. It worked perfectly. Administered 40-methyl-alkyl potassium chloride through IV port at 2:32 a.m. Cardiac arrest at 2:47 a.m. as expected. Code called unsuccessful resuscitation, pronounced at 3:11 a.m. Dr. Foster attributed to cardiac arrhythmia from underlying disease. No suspicion. Will wait 2 months before claiming insurance to avoid raising flags. Similar entries documented the murders of Robert Chen, Dorothy Martinez, and James Richardson, with clinical detachment describing the methods, timing, and results of each killing. The final pages of the notebook contained Jessica's financial calculations, how much money she needed to pay specific debts, which credit cards to pay off first, and plans for future insurance money. She had even started researching potential 5th and 6th victims before James Richardson's death triggered the hospital investigation. Sarah sat in the garage reading the notebook with growing horror, barely able to process what she was seeing. Her mother, the woman who had raised her, who she loved, was a serial killer who had murdered 4 elderly people for insurance money and had documented her crimes in meticulous detail. I felt like the world was ending, Sarah testified, her voice shaking. I couldn't breathe. I kept reading the entries over and over, hoping I was misunderstanding, hoping it was some kind of sick joke or creative writing project. But it wasn't. It was real. My mother had murdered 4 people. She had written about it like she was documenting a science experiment, no emotion, no regret, just clinical descriptions of how she killed them and how much money she'd make. Sarah faced an impossible decision. She could pretend she hadn't found the notebook, put it back in the box, and try to forget what she'd read. She could confront her mother and give her a chance to explain. Or she could do what she knew was right but would destroy her family. She could turn the evidence over to police and expose her own mother as a murderer. I sat in that garage for over an hour, just holding the notebook and crying, Sarah testified. Part of me wanted to protect my mom, to find some way to make this not be real. But I kept thinking about the people she killed. They were real people with families who loved them. They had trusted my mom, and she had murdered them for money. And there were notes about potential future victims. She was planning to kill more people. I couldn't let that happen. Even though she's my mother, even though turning her in would destroy my life, I had to do the right thing. Sarah photographed every page of the notebook with her phone, then put the notebook back in the box exactly as she'd found it. She called her father, who was initially skeptical, but became horrified as Sarah described what she'd found. Together, they contacted Detective Williams and arranged to meet. When Sarah Hartwell contacted me and described finding a notebook with her mother's murder planning and documentation, I honestly thought it might be a misunderstanding or exaggeration, Detective Williams testified. Family members often misinterpret things, especially in high-stress situations. But when Sarah showed me the photographs she'd taken, I knew we had exactly what we needed to prove Jessica Hartwell's guilt beyond any doubt. This notebook was a complete confession premeditation, method, motive, and documentation of each murder written in Jessica's own hand. Detective Williams immediately obtained a search warrant for the Hartwell residence. On April 17, 2024, police executed the warrant and recovered the notebook from the garage, along with additional evidence including Jessica's financial records, correspondence with insurance companies, and her computer containing internet search history about potassium chloride poisoning and medical murders. Jessica Hartwell was arrested that same evening and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. She was held without bail given the severity of the charges and the evidence that she had been researching additional potential victims. The arrest made national headlines: trusted nurse charged with murdering 4 patients for insurance money, angel of death, Oakland nurse accused of serial killings, daughter exposes mother as accused serial killer. Media coverage focused not just on the murders themselves, but on the shocking betrayal by a healthcare provider and the courage of a 16-year-old girl who had chosen justice over family loyalty. Sarah's decision to expose her mother came at an enormous personal cost. She became the subject of intense media scrutiny and public debate. Some praised her courage and moral clarity, while others criticized her for betraying her own mother. She required intensive therapy to process the trauma of discovering her mother's crimes and the guilt of being the one to turn her in. And she faced the reality that her testimony would likely be crucial to her mother's conviction, meaning she would have to testify against her own mother in court. Sarah showed more courage and integrity than most adults would possess in her situation. David Hartwell stated in an interview after Jessica's arrest. She was faced with an impossible choice, and she chose truth and justice over family loyalty. I'm proud of her and heartbroken for her. No child should have to expose their own parent as a murderer, but Sarah did what was right despite the personal cost. The interrogation of Jessica Hartwell, conducted 2 hours after her arrest with her attorney present, provided additional insight into her psychology and her stunning lack of genuine remorse. Unlike many defendants who deny guilt or express regret when confronted with evidence, Jessica maintained her cold, calculated demeanor, even when presented with her own notebook documenting her crimes. Detective Williams began the interrogation by informing Jessica that her daughter had found and photographed the notebook before police recovered the original. Jessica's reaction was telling: not horror at being exposed, but fury at her daughter's betrayal. Sarah did this? My own daughter. Jessica's voice was sharp with anger rather than grief. I can't believe she would betray me like this. After everything I've done for her, all the sacrifices I made raising her alone after the divorce. She goes through my things and turns over private materials to police? That's a violation of trust. That's unforgivable. Detective Williams noted that Jessica's anger was directed at Sarah for exposing her rather than at herself for committing the murders. Miss Hartwell, your notebook documents 4 murders. You described in detail how you killed Margaret Walsh, Robert Chen, Dorothy Martinez, and James Richardson. Your daughter didn't betray you, she exposed you. There's a difference. Jessica's attorney attempted to intervene, but Jessica continued. Those were private notes. They were in my personal property. Sarah had no right to go through my things, and even if those notes are real, they don't prove anything. They could be creative writing, research for a novel, hypothetical scenarios. You can't prove I actually did anything. We have your notebook documenting the murders, financial records showing you received insurance payouts totaling $185,000 from the victims, pharmacy records showing you accessed potassium chloride before each death, and forensic evidence showing 3 of the 4 victims were poisoned with potassium chloride. Detective Williams stated, "We have everything we need to prove you murdered 4 people. What we want to understand is why." Jessica's response revealed the narcissism and complete lack of empathy that had enabled her to commit the murders. Why? Because I needed money, and they were going to die soon anyway. They were all elderly with serious health problems. Margaret had heart disease. Robert had multiple comorbidities. Dorothy was 79 with complications from surgery. James was 81 with heart failure. None of them had more than a few years left, even if I hadn't helped them along. I just accelerated the inevitable and made sure their money went to someone who could actually use it instead of sitting in estate accounts. This statement framing murder as helping them along and accelerating the inevitable demonstrated Jessica's ability to rationalize her crimes without genuine moral recognition of their wrongness. She showed no remorse for the victims or their families, only justification for her actions based on her own financial needs. These were people who trusted you, Detective Williams pressed. They were your patients. You took an oath to care for them, and you murdered them for money. They weren't suffering. They died quickly, peacefully in their sleep. They didn't feel pain. If anything, I saved them from prolonged decline and eventual worse deaths. Jessica responded, still rationalizing. And yes, I benefited financially, but they chose to name me as beneficiary. They wanted to provide for me because I was good to them. That was their decision. The interrogation continued for over 3 hours, with Jessica alternating between justification, rationalization, and anger at being exposed. She never expressed genuine remorse for her victims. She never acknowledged the betrayal of trust or the moral wrongness of murdering vulnerable patients. Her only concerns were about her own situation and her anger at Sarah for exposing her. That interrogation was one of the most disturbing I've conducted in my career, Detective Williams later testified. Jessica Hartwell showed no empathy, no remorse, no recognition that she'd done anything truly wrong. She was a textbook psychopath, superficially charming when it served her purposes, but underneath completely lacking the emotional capacity for genuine human connection or moral feeling. She had murdered 4 people and was angry at her daughter for exposing her, but she felt nothing for her victims. Based on Jessica's statements during interrogation and the overwhelming evidence against her, prosecutors moved forward with first-degree murder charges and announced they would seek the maximum sentence life without possibility of parole for each count. Given the strength of the evidence, particularly the notebook documenting Jessica's planning and execution of the murders, her defense team faced the nearly impossible task of creating reasonable doubt or generating jury sympathy for a serial killer nurse who had murdered vulnerable elderly patients for insurance money. The trial began on June 3, 2024, before Judge Patricia Chen in Alameda County Superior Court. The case had attracted enormous media attention both locally and nationally, with coverage focusing on the betrayal of trust inherent in medical murders, the insurance fraud scheme, and especially Sarah Hartwell's role in exposing her mother. Jury selection took 2 weeks given extensive pretrial publicity and the need to find jurors who could be impartial despite knowing general facts about the case. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 29 to 71, including several healthcare workers, parents, and retirees, a mix of backgrounds that would allow them to understand both the medical evidence and the emotional impact of Jessica's crimes. Prosecutor Jennifer Martinez's opening statement was powerful and comprehensive. Jessica Hartwell murdered 4 elderly patients who trusted her with their lives. She selected victims based on their vulnerability, elderly people with serious health conditions, whose deaths could be attributed to natural causes. She befriended them, gained their trust, helped them purchase life insurance policies, and convinced them to name her as a beneficiary. Then she murdered them by injecting lethal doses of potassium chloride into their IV lines, causing cardiac arrest that mimicked natural deaths. She collected insurance money totaling $185,000 from their deaths and was researching potential 5th and 6th victims when she was caught. Martinez outlined the evidence the jury would see. You will hear testimony from the victims' families about how Jessica befriended their loved ones and manipulated them into changing their insurance. You will hear from medical experts about how potassium chloride causes cardiac arrest and why it's difficult to detect. You will see pharmacy records showing Jessica accessed potassium chloride before each death. You will see surveillance footage placing her in the victims' rooms during critical time periods. You will hear forensic evidence proving 3 of the 4 victims were poisoned. And most damning, you will see Jessica's own notebook recovered by her 16-year-old daughter, where Jessica documented her planning, her murders, and her plans for future victims. Defense attorney Robert Harrison faced an unenviable task. The evidence of Jessica's guilt was overwhelming, and her lack of remorse made her profoundly unsympathetic. His strategy focused on questioning the reliability of certain evidence and attempting to generate some minimal sympathy for Jessica by emphasizing her financial desperation and suggesting mental illness. Jessica Hartwell stands accused of terrible crimes, Harrison stated in his opening. The prosecution will present evidence suggesting she committed these acts, but I ask you to carefully examine that evidence. The notebook, claimed to be a confession, could be interpreted differently. The forensic evidence has limitations. The financial evidence shows correlation but not necessarily causation. And, most importantly, ask yourselves whether someone in Jessica's situation, facing bankruptcy, drowning in debt, struggling with the pressures of single motherhood, and a demanding career, might have made desperate decisions while not fully comprehending the magnitude of what she was doing. Mental illness, depression, and financial desperation can cloud judgment. The question isn't just what happened, but why, and whether Jessica truly understood the full moral weight of her actions. The defense strategy was weak, the evidence was too strong, and Jessica's documented planning demonstrated she clearly understood what she was doing, but it was one of the few approaches available. The prosecution's case proceeded over 6 weeks, systematically building an overwhelming evidentiary foundation. Family members of each victim testified about how Jessica had befriended their loved ones, helped with insurance, and positioned herself to benefit from their deaths. The testimony was emotionally powerful, highlighting the humanity of the victims and the betrayal of trust. Medical experts explained how potassium chloride works, how it causes cardiac arrest, and why it's difficult to detect post-mortem. Dr. Patricia Foster testified about her forensic examinations of the exhumed bodies and her conclusions that they had been poisoned. Her testimony was technical but clear, establishing that the victims had been murdered rather than dying naturally. Hospital administrators testified about the suspicious pattern of deaths that had triggered the investigation. Pharmacy and IT staff testified about Jessica's access to potassium chloride and her electronic activities around the times of death. The cumulative testimony established Jessica's opportunity and means. Financial experts testified about Jessica's desperate situation in late 2022 and the insurance payouts she received from each victim's death. The testimony established clear motive and demonstrated Jessica's financial benefit from the murders. But the most damaging evidence was the notebook itself and the testimony from Detective Williams about its contents. The notebook was entered as evidence and projected on screens, so jurors could see Jessica's handwriting documenting her research, her victim profiles, her signature practice, and her post-murder notes. This notebook is Jessica Hartwell's confession, Martinez stated during her presentation of the evidence. In her own handwriting, she documented researching potassium chloride as a murder weapon. She profiled her victims. She practiced forging their signatures in case she needed to. She documented administering lethal injections and watching them go into cardiac arrest. She calculated her profits from each murder. This isn't ambiguous. This isn't creative writing. This is a serial killer's journal documenting her crimes. The jury sat in complete silence as selected pages from the notebook were displayed and read aloud. Several jurors were visibly disturbed by the clinical detachment in Jessica's descriptions of the murders: administered 40 μQ potassium chloride, cardiac arrest as expected, no suspicion. The lack of any emotional content or recognition of the victims as human beings was chilling. The most anticipated and emotionally powerful testimony came from Sarah Hartwell, who took the stand during the trial's 7th week. The courtroom was packed media, victim family members, legal observers, and members of the public who wanted to witness the teenage daughter testify against her serial killer mother. Sarah entered the courtroom holding hands with her father, David. At 16 years old, she looked younger and more fragile than her age, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She wore a simple dress and carried a photograph of her mother and herself from happier times, a choice her victim advocate had suggested to remind the jury of the impossible position Sarah had been in. Prosecutor Martinez approached gently, establishing rapport before moving to substantive testimony. "Sarah, I know this is incredibly difficult for you. Thank you for being here and being willing to tell the truth despite how hard it is." Sarah nodded, glancing once toward her mother at the defense table. Jessica sat stone-faced, showing no emotion toward her daughter, not love, not grief, just cold detachment that Sarah had learned was her mother's true nature. "Sarah, can you tell the jury about April 15th, 2024, and what you found in your garage?" Sarah took a deep breath and began her testimony, her voice soft but clear. She described noticing changes in her mother's behavior over the previous year, the suspicious financial improvements, and her growing doubts about her mother's explanations. She described deciding to search the garage and finding the notebook. "When I started reading it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Sarah testified, tears beginning to stream down her face. "It was my mom's handwriting, her notes about researching how to kill people with potassium chloride. Profiles of the 4 patients who had died: Margaret, Robert, Dorothy, and James, with notes about their medical conditions and how to manipulate them. Pages where she practiced writing their signatures. And then descriptions of actually killing them, written like she was documenting a science experiment." Martinez walked Sarah through specific notebook entries, asking her to confirm they were in her mother's handwriting and to describe her reaction when reading them. Sarah's testimony was devastating. A daughter, forced to confront the reality that her mother was a serial killer and having to make the impossible choice to expose her. "What did you do after you found the notebook?" Martinez asked. "I photographed every page because I was afraid if I took the notebook, my mom would know I'd found it and would destroy evidence. Then I put it back exactly where I found it. I called my dad and told him what I'd discovered. He didn't believe me at first. He thought I must be misunderstanding or misinterpreting. But when I showed him the photos, he realized it was real. We contacted Detective Williams together." Sarah's voice broke with emotion as she continued. "I knew turning in that evidence would send my mom to prison. I knew it would destroy our family. But those people she killed, they were real people with families who loved them. They trusted her, and she murdered them for money. And she was researching more potential victims. I couldn't let her kill anyone else. Even though she's my mother, I had to do the right thing." Martinez's final question was direct. "Sarah, do you believe your mother murdered those 4 patients?" Sarah looked directly at the jury, tears streaming down her face but her voice steady. "Yes. I saw her own words documenting how she did it. She murdered them. And I think if she hadn't been caught, she would have murdered more people. That's why I had to come forward, even though it meant testifying against my own mother." Cross-examination of Sarah was challenging for defense attorney Harrison, who needed to question her testimony without appearing to attack a sympathetic teenage witness. He attempted to suggest that Sarah had misinterpreted the notebook, or that it might have been creative writing rather than actual planning. Sarah, is it possible your mother was writing fiction, perhaps researching for a novel about a nurse who commits murders? No, Sarah responded firmly. The entries included specific dates that matched when the patients actually died. She wrote about collecting specific insurance amounts that matched the actual payouts she received. It wasn't fiction. It was documentation of real murders she committed. Harrison attempted a different approach. You love your mother, don't you? I did love her. I thought I knew her. But the person I loved doesn't really exist. The real person underneath is someone who murdered 4 people for money and felt nothing about it. That's not someone I can love anymore. Sarah's answer revealed the profound grief and betrayal she felt she had lost her mother not to death, but to the revelation of who her mother truly was. The cross-examination failed to undermine Sarah's credibility. Several jurors later reported that Sarah's testimony was the most powerful evidence in the case, with one juror stating, "When that little girl got on the stand and talked about finding her mother's murder journal and having to make the choice to turn her own mother in, there wasn't a dry eye in the jury box." Her courage and moral clarity at just 16 years old was extraordinary. And the contrast between Sarah's genuine emotion and Jessica's cold detachment throughout the trial was striking. Sarah showed more humanity and compassion in her testimony than Jessica had shown throughout the entire case. The defense's case was brief and largely unsuccessful. Harrison called mental health experts who testified about depression and financial stress, suggesting these factors might have impaired Jessica's judgment. But the testimony was unconvincing given the extensive planning Jessica had documented and her clear understanding of what she was doing. Harrison called character witnesses who testified about Jessica's competence as a nurse and her devotion to her daughter, attempting to humanize Jessica and create some sympathy. But the testimony was undermined by Jessica's own notebook and her complete lack of remorse. The defense's critical decision was whether to have Jessica testify. Harrison strongly advised against it, knowing that Jessica's lack of genuine remorse and her narcissistic personality would alienate jurors. But Jessica insisted on testifying, apparently believing she could convince the jury that she had been misunderstood and that the evidence was being misinterpreted. Jessica's testimony was a complete disaster. Taking the stand dressed in professional clothing meant to remind jurors of her nursing career, Jessica attempted to present herself as a dedicated healthcare provider who had been falsely accused due to unfortunate coincidences and family betrayal. "I devoted my career to caring for patients," Jessica testified, her tone measured and her affect flat. "I formed genuine connections with Margaret, Robert, Dorothy, and James. They were lonely, elderly patients who appreciated having a nurse who took time to talk with them, to listen to their stories, to treat them as people rather than just medical cases. The fact that they chose to name me as a beneficiary on their insurance policies was their decision, their way of thanking me for the care I provided. I didn't manipulate them or solicit those bequests." Martinez's cross-examination destroyed Jessica's testimony. She confronted Jessica with specific notebook entries, forcing her to either acknowledge her guilt or offer implausible alternative explanations. "Ms. Hartwell, you wrote in your notebook, and I quote, Administered 40 ml EQ potassium chloride through IV port at 2:32 a.m. Cardiac arrest at 2:47 a.m. as expected. That's describing Margaret Walsh's death. How is that anything other than a confession to murder? That notebook was personal writing, private thoughts. It wasn't meant to be taken literally. I was processing my feelings about patient deaths through writing. Jessica's explanation was transparently false. You documented the exact dosage of potassium chloride, the exact time you administered it, and the exact time the cardiac arrest occurred as expected. That sounds like documentation of a murder you committed, not processing feelings. Jessica had no good answer. Her testimony continued to unravel as Martinez walked her through entry after entry from the notebook, each one demolishing Jessica's claims of innocence. Most damaging was when Martinez asked Jessica directly about her daughter's testimony. Your daughter Sarah testified that she loves you, but that she had to expose you because you had murdered 4 people and were planning to murder more. Do you have anything to say to Sarah? Jessica's response revealed her true nature. Sarah betrayed me. She went through my private property without permission. She violated my trust and my privacy. She chose strangers over her own mother. I don't know if I can ever forgive her for what she's done to our family. The lack of any recognition that she had betrayed her patients, that she had committed 4 murders, that she had destroyed her family through her own choices. The complete focus on her own victimization was devastating. Several jurors later reported that this answer convinced them absolutely that Jessica was a narcissistic psychopath, incapable of genuine remorse or moral understanding. Closing arguments reinforced the competing narratives. Martinez's closing was comprehensive and passionate. Jessica Hartwell murdered 4 vulnerable elderly patients who trusted her with their lives. She selected them carefully, befriended them, manipulated them into naming her as an insurance beneficiary, and then killed them with potassium chloride to collect their insurance money. She documented everything in a notebook she thought was safely hidden, a notebook that her brave daughter found and turned over to police. The evidence is overwhelming. Jessica is guilty, and she deserves the maximum punishment our law allows. Harrison's closing attempted one final time to create doubt or sympathy. The prosecution has presented evidence, but ask yourselves whether that evidence proves guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Ask whether Jessica, facing financial desperation and mental health challenges, might deserve some compassion rather than maximum punishment. She's a human being who made terrible choices, but is life without parole appropriate? The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days before announcing they had reached verdicts. The courtroom was packed when they returned. Jessica sat at the defense table, still showing the same cold detachment she had maintained throughout the trial. Will the defendant please rise? Judge Chen instructed. Jessica stood, and for just a moment her eyes found Sarah in the gallery, sitting with her father. Sarah stared back at her mother with an expression of profound grief. Not grief that her mother would be convicted, but grief for who her mother truly was, and for the childhood illusion of maternal love that had been forever shattered. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached verdicts? Yes, Your Honor, we have. What are your verdicts? In the case of the State of California versus Jessica Hartwell, on the charge of first-degree murder of Margaret Walsh, We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in gasps and reactions. The foreperson continued, reading identical guilty verdicts for the murders of Robert Chen, Dorothy Martinez, and James Richardson, as well as guilty verdicts on all fraud and conspiracy charges. Jessica's face showed shock and dawning horror. She had maintained confidence throughout the trial, apparently still believing she might be acquitted or convicted on lesser charges. The 4 guilty verdicts for first-degree murder, each carrying a potential life sentence, finally broke through her narcissistic confidence. The conviction triggered the sentencing phase, which would take an additional 2 weeks as families provided victim impact statements and experts testified about appropriate punishment. The prosecution sought 4 consecutive life terms without parole, meaning Jessica would never be eligible for release under any circumstances. The defense argued for concurrent sentences with parole eligibility after 25 years, claiming that even serial killers deserved some hope of eventual release. The victim impact testimony was heartbreaking. Linda Walsh Porter, Margaret Walsh's daughter, testified, "My mother trusted Jessica. She thought Jessica was her friend, and Jessica murdered her for $50,000. Mom's life was worth more than money. She was a person, a mother, a grandmother. She mattered. And Jessica took her away from us just to pay her credit card bills." Michael Chen, Robert's son, testified, "My father was lonely after my mother died. He was grateful for human connection and kindness. Jessica exploited that loneliness to manipulate him into naming her as a beneficiary, and then she killed him. She preyed on his vulnerability. She deserves no mercy." The testimony from all 4 families emphasized the humanity of the victims, the trust they had placed in Jessica, and the devastating impact of their losses. Many family members specifically noted that Jessica had shown no remorse, even during the trial, and that this complete lack of empathy warranted the harshest possible punishment. The jury recommended 4 consecutive life terms, without possibility of parole, the maximum sentence. Judge Chen scheduled formal sentencing for September 18, 2024, giving both sides time to prepare final statements. The sentencing hearing on September 18, 2024, the scene we opened with would become one of the most memorable in California criminal justice history. Not just for the severity of the sentence, but for Judge Chen's powerful statement about Jessica's betrayal of trust and her specific acknowledgement of Sarah Hartwell's courage. Judge Chen began by formally imposing sentence. "Jessica Hartwell, you have been convicted by a jury of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The jury has recommended 4 consecutive life terms, without possibility of parole. This court accepts that recommendation. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment, without possibility of parole on each count, to be served consecutively. You will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. You will never be released." The judge then delivered the personal statement that captured the moral dimensions of the case. "You murdered 4 vulnerable elderly patients who trusted you with their lives. You weaponized your position as a nurse, your medical knowledge, and your access to patients to commit serial murder for financial gain. You showed no mercy to your victims and no remorse after their deaths. You have demonstrated yourself to be a danger to society and utterly unfit for the trust placed in healthcare providers." Judge Chen's voice rose with emotion as she addressed Jessica's lack of remorse. Throughout this trial, you have shown no genuine empathy for your victims or their families. Your only concerns have been for yourself, your financial situation, your reputation, your anger at being caught. Even your testimony revealed not remorse, but justification. You claimed your victims were going to die soon anyway, as if that excused murdering them. This level of moral bankruptcy and absence of empathy justifies the maximum sentence available. The judge specifically addressed Sarah's courage. Your daughter showed more integrity and moral courage than you have shown in your entire life. At 16 years old, she made the hardest decision any child could make to expose her own mother as a murderer. She did it because it was right, because your victims deserved justice, because you were planning to kill more people. Sarah sacrificed her relationship with you to protect others and to honor the memory of the people you killed. She is a remarkable young woman who deserves to be celebrated for her courage. Judge Chen concluded, "You will die in prison, Jessica Hartwell. You will grow old behind bars, with decades to think about the lives you took and the trust you betrayed. That is the only just outcome for someone who committed your crimes." As bailiffs moved to escort Jessica from the courtroom, she looked one final time at Sarah. "I hope you're happy," Jessica said coldly. "You destroyed our family." Sarah, tears streaming down her face, responded with words that captured both her grief and her moral clarity. "You destroyed our family when you murdered those people. I just exposed what you did." The courtroom doors closed behind Jessica Hartwell, and she was transported to California's Central California Women's Facility to begin serving her 4 consecutive life terms. She would spend the rest of her life, potentially 40, 50 or more years behind bars, never eligible for parole, never able to harm another patient. The case generated extensive discussion about medical murders, about warning signs that healthcare institutions should watch for, and about the profound courage required for Sarah Hartwell to expose her own mother. Sarah became an advocate for victims of medical violence, speaking about her experience and the importance of speaking truth even when it comes at great personal cost. "I lost my mother," Sarah said in a speech at a victims' rights conference 1 year after the trial. "But I didn't really lose her. I discovered who she really was, and that person was never really my mother. The mother I thought I had was a performance, a mask hiding someone who was capable of murdering vulnerable people for money. Turning her in was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most important thing I've ever done. Margaret, Robert, Dorothy, and James deserved justice, and the people my mother might have killed if she hadn't been stopped deserved to be protected." For the families of Jessica's victims, the sentence provided some closure, but couldn't restore their loved ones. They had lost parents and grandparents to a trusted health care provider who had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Several family members participated in advocacy for better oversight of healthcare workers and better protection for vulnerable patients. Oakland Memorial Hospital implemented enhanced monitoring systems, increased scrutiny of patient deaths, and mandatory reporting protocols for any suspicious patterns. The case became a teaching example in medical ethics courses and in criminal justice programs studying serial killers. From prison, Jessica's adjustment was reportedly difficult. Prison psychological evaluations described her as struggling with depression, angry at her situation and still focused primarily on her own suffering rather than showing genuine remorse for her victims. When asked about her crimes during counseling sessions, Jessica reportedly continued to rationalize and justify, claiming she had helped her victims by giving them peaceful deaths, and that she was being unfairly punished for actions that had benefited everyone. Jessica Hartwell remains what she was when she committed her crimes, a narcissistic psychopath incapable of genuine empathy or moral understanding, reported prison psychologist Dr. Michael Foster in an evaluation 2 years after sentencing. She expresses anger at her daughter for exposing her, anger at the criminal justice system for convicting her, and self-pity about her incarceration. She shows no authentic remorse for her victims. Her expressions of regret, when they occur, are clearly performative rather than genuine. As of 2026, Jessica Hartwell remains incarcerated in California, serving her 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. She is now 43 years old and has decades of imprisonment ahead before her eventual death in custody. Her appeals have been exhausted, with appellate courts finding no reversible errors in her trial or sentencing. Sarah Hartwell, now 18, has started college and continues her therapy and advocacy work. She carries the trauma of discovering her mother's crimes and the burden of having exposed her, but she has found purpose in speaking truth and helping others understand the importance of moral courage even when it comes at great personal cost. The case of Jessica Hartwell stands as a sobering reminder of how positions of trust can be weaponized by those who lack conscience, how vulnerable populations need protection from those who would exploit them, and how even family loyalty must sometimes yield to truth and justice. Jessica thought her position as a trusted nurse, her careful planning, and her hidden documentation would allow her to commit the perfect murders. She didn't count on her own daughter having more courage, more integrity, and more genuine compassion than Jessica herself possessed. Sarah Hartwell exposed her mother as a serial killer, testified against her in court, and ensured that justice was served for 4 elderly victims who had trusted the wrong nurse with their lives. Jessica Hartwell murdered for money and thought she would get away with it. Instead, her own daughter made sure she would spend the rest of her life in prison, a fitting end for someone who betrayed the most fundamental trust in health care, and whose lack of empathy was ultimately exposed by the one person she never suspected would have the courage to stop her.